Welcome to Specific Love. Here recently we've had a bunch of newcomers coming into the DIY community, so I wanted to get back to the basics and help them out with their tools. With that said, let's talk about routers. Now a router in its most basic form is just a motor that spins a bit at a very high rate of speed. Now the most common routers you'll find are palm routers, fixed base routers, and plunge routers. Now routers can range anywhere from under 1 horsepower to over 3 horsepower. It really just depends on the make and model that you would like. Now some of the higher output versions are definitely going to require a cord just because of the consistent electricity they need for the motor. But when it comes to palm routers, usually you can get those with batteries, and that'll allow you to work and get around on smaller projects much easier. Now here's just a quick overview of some of the parts you'll find in a router. Of course, your base, in many cases it'll be plastic so it can move real easy and not scratch your project. You'll have your bits that'll be stuck in the bottom, and they're actually held in place by what they call the collet. Now to get the bits in and out, you have to lock the collet in place. In many cases you'll have buttons, and sometimes you might actually have to stick 2 wrenches in there. But if you do have a lock button, you'll press it down and you'll be able to use 1 wrench to get that in and out. On most of your routers, you'll find an adjustment on the side here, so you can quickly adjust and then finally adjust the depth of your bit here so you can get the exact depth that you would like. Now on some of your routers, you'll even have a speed adjustment so you can adjust the speed. Some router bits need faster and some need slower. And of course, an on and off button. Now here are a bunch of tips to make your routing projects even better. Now when you're using a router, it's usually going to be pretty loud, and it's going to be slinging a bunch of wood, and of course making a lot of dust. So make sure you wear the appropriate protective gear. Now when we're new to using a router, there's a good chance we might accidentally cut in the wrong direction. Let me show you. Now when we're using a router, we always have to take in consideration which way it is spinning. When it is facing down, it's going to be spinning in a clockwise manner, so therefore we need to go around the piece for routing in a counterclockwise fashion. Let me show you what it looks like a little bit easier with this blade. And now the bit is going to be spinning in this direction, so we want to make sure we go against the way it is cutting so that it easily allows us to keep control of it and remove that wood. If it is spinning like this and we go in the opposite direction, there's a good chance it's going to want to run away from us. So if we're using a router inappropriately, it could easily jump back at you. Now when we're cutting on the inside of a project, like just imagine this is a picture frame and we need to smooth out this inner edge. We do it a little bit different than we do with the outside. Remember, the outside we cut in a counterclockwise fashion. On the inside we actually cut in a clockwise fashion. Now that might seem a little bit weird, but we're still taking in consideration the way the blade is spinning. And since it's still spinning clockwise, we're going still against the grain as we're coming in, and that way it makes a nice smooth cut and you should be able to control it nicely. Now if you're having a hard time remembering which way the router is spinning, here's a little tip I picked up from Jonathan Cat Moses. Take your right hand, gently close your fingers, and have your thumb sticking out. Now imagine your thumb is the bit. If the bit is facing down, then look at your fingers. Look which way they're actually turned, for example, in a clockwise manner. Therefore the bit is going to be spinning clockwise. Now if you take it and you have the router facing up, now your fingers are going to be facing in a counterclockwise manner. So if you can't remember which way your router's spinning, look at your right hand. Now when we're talking about routers, we got to remember it's really all about the bits. There are tons and tons of varieties of bits that make a bunch of different designs that you'll be using with your router. But before you start, I would strongly suggest going on Amazon and buying a cheap set. This had, I believe, 24 bits in it, and I got it for probably around $30 or $40. That right there will allow you to play and figure out which bits you like the most. Now keep in mind, these are cheap, these will wear out quick, and sometimes not even give the exact finish that you like. So once you've figured out which bits you will use the most, then go spend the money on quality bits. They will last a long time and give you the best finish. So what exactly is a better quality bit? There's a couple indicators for you. One, definitely price to look for. If you have a $5 bit and a $50 bit that look almost identical, chances are the $50 bit is going to definitely be better quality. Now there's another indicator. Look at what it's made out of. Usually they're made out of either a high-speed steel or a carbide. Now most woodworkers prefer to buy the carbide, and yes, it is more expensive, but it has a tendency to last many times longer than the high-speed steel. So first off, look for price, and then look for the carbide. When we're looking for bits, we also got to look at the size of the shaft on your bits. For example, both of these are 1/2 inch dovetail bits, but this one over here has a 1/2 inch shaft and this has a 1/4 inch shaft. We need to make sure that the cullet, that's what holds the bit inside your router here, is the correct size. Now some routers, for example this one, that is interchangeable between 1/2 inch and 1/4 inch, but some are not. So make sure you have the right shaft for your router. Something else to keep in mind when you're buying your bits is the maximum speed your bits can handle. Usually the smaller, real narrow bits can handle a lot of speed, but when you start getting larger and larger bits, you got to be very careful of the maximum amount of speed it can handle. For example, I know some of the bits can get up to at least 3.5 inches, probably even larger. When you get up to that size bits, they have to be spun at a much slower speed. So make sure you know exactly what the maximum amount of speed your bit can be spun up to and adjust your router accordingly. Now when you're installing your bits into your cullet here, you want to lower it down into it and then lift it up about 1/8 to 1/4 inch. And the reason why is a lot of times on your bits, you're gonna have a little raised edge or maybe a curved edge, or in my case I have some paint here, and you want to avoid all that. You wanna make sure the cullet gets a nice firm grip on the entire shaft so it is in there firm and safe. So remember, lower it down in, lift up about 1/4 inch. Now if you happen to have an old router that requires 2 wrenches to put the bit in and out, sometimes when you're trying to take the bit out, you find yourself struggling. It's just hard, and a lot of times when you do get it, you'll ram your hands together and you'll bust some knuckles. Here's an easier way to do it. Put 1 wrench on the back and 1 wrench on the front, and you want to have them just a little bit apart like so. And then just use one hand to squeeze it. You can easily take it out. Now before you start routing on your main project, I'd strongly suggest getting a piece of scrap and do some test cuts on it. That'll allow you to check the depth, and it'll just prepare you for anything that may be like tear out or burning of your wood that you're not expecting. Because some woods burn a lot easier than others, and this will allow you to at least test it out so you know what you're going to have to adjust and expect on your main project. Now if you're experiencing a lot of burning while you're using your router, here's 4 ways to help fix that. 1, check the speed of your bit. You might be running it way too high and it's just causing it to heat up and burn your wood. 2, you could be taking just too heavy of a pass. You're just taking too much wood off at one time and that could burn it as well. Also, number 3, you could be going a little too slow. If you're going real slow on your wood, you're just heating up that wood from your bit and it could be burning it. And number 4, you could just have a dull bit. It might be time that you need to get them sharpened or just buy some new ones. So what is the appropriate depth you should cut at one time? That can vary anywhere on your project and the type of wood you're working with, to anywhere from 1/8 to 1/4 inch cut at a time. Now if you happen to have a plunge router, a lot of times they'll have a depth block here that'll allow you to turn, and so you don't have to go in and adjust everything. This will limit exactly how deep you're going to be cutting. If you happen to have a fixed base, you will have to go in, loosen it up, adjust it manually, and tighten it back up. In any case, remember, about 1/8 to 1/4 inch cut. Now when you're shopping for bits, there will be 2 main types you'll be looking at. Those with the bearings and those without. Now the ones with the bearings will usually be following the edgier material, and you usually do not need a guide for them. But the ones without a bearing, you definitely need to have a guide or a template to follow, or they can make a big mess of your project. Now when you're using bits that have bearings, you got to be careful what you're cutting on, because any imperfections in the wood will actually transfer into your cut. Let me show you. Now let's say we wanted to use a round over bit on the edge of this wood here, but if you notice there's a knot here that's missing and a little tear out. If we were to use a round over bit on that edge, this bearing would want to fall into each of those low points and therefore have a corresponding notch up here on the side of your edge. So be careful and make sure the side of your wood is smooth as well. Now using a router by hand can make some awesome projects, but sometimes you need both hands on your project just to make it a little easier and safer. That's when you need to have a router and a router table. Now you can go out and buy a bunch of different types of pre-manufactured router tables, and those should work well for you. But I actually built my own in one of my workbenches. That way I have one less item in my shop. Now if you're interested in learning how I built this, I did a video about 4 years ago going into detail showing how I did this. I'll put a link to that in the description if you're interested. And when you're using a router table, again, we need to remember which way the blade is spinning. So remember to use your hand method. It's facing up, so therefore the blade's going to be spinning counterclockwise. And therefore we need to take the wood and go in at this direction, going against the way the blade is cutting. On most modern routers, you're going to find they have a dust collection port, or at least one you can attach to your router. In those cases, I would strongly suggest using it when possible. Sometimes you might not be able to, depending on the location you're going to be putting it in, but when possible, use it. Otherwise, you're going to quickly find out that these machines make a big mess. And I don't mean just all around you, but I mean just a flume of dust as well. So when you have a dust port and you can use it, use it. Now, if you're using a router, it's a good practice to wait till the bit comes to a complete stop before you set your router down. But to be honest, I can be a little bit impatient, especially when I'm using a router. And if I'm using the palm router, it's not that big a deal because I can set it down on its battery and it's out of the way. But if I'm using the larger router just like this, well, I can't really set it down easily without it easily being tipped over. And if I set it on its side, well, now I get an exposed blade that can be easily bumped into. So I created this little stand. This is just some 2x material that I've glued together. And when I'm done using the router, I can turn it off, set it on that. It's pretty sturdy and I don't have to worry about waiting until the blade stops completely before I can move on to the next piece. Now, if you need to make the same cut over and over again with your router, I'd strongly suggest building yourself a jig. A jig is just an attachment that goes onto your router, or for that matter, about any other tool that will allow you to make the same repetitive cut over and over again. Now, I could sit here and I could draw out a jig for you, but just do a search on YouTube and you will have a bunch more jigs than I could ever show you in this video. So, if you need to make repetitive cuts, build yourself a jig. Now, of the three main types of routers, which one would I suggest for you? It really just depends on the kind of work you plan on using it for. Now, if you're going to be using it for lightweight, maybe just round over bits or on the outside of your project, you don't plan on plunging into the wood, then I'd probably suggest getting a palm router. I find myself grabbing this a lot and using it quite a bit with my projects. Now, if you're interested in maybe creating some jigs, or maybe using it in a table router, or just anything else that needs a little bit more power, I'd probably go with one of the larger fixed base routers. Now, if you're interested in doing something maybe like mortise and tenon work, where you need to plunge into it, or maybe some timber framing, then I would suggest probably getting a plunge router. It really just depends on the type of router you need, so choose wisely. Now, there's a bunch of great tips for routers, and if by chance you know of any others, please put those in the comments below because we want to help out as many beginners as possible. Now, right over here, I'm going to have a playlist of some other tools with a bunch of great tips for them, so make sure you check those out as well. Otherwise, get out in your shop and have fun building. Router, now routers, bleh, I can't talk. That you're going to be